Unit 6.1, the Renaissance. Today's key questions will include what factors led to the Renaissance, what characteristics describe the Renaissance, and what were the political, economic, and social impacts of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is an artistic and intellectual movement in Europe focused on classical culture. So what does that mean? Artistic, maybe painting, sculpture, architecture, and intellectual. Ideas, philosophy, science, literature, and it's focused on classical culture. That means the Greek and Roman. What did our ancestors think about, talk about, create? Roughly the years 1300 to 1600. It will begin in Italy, which we'll talk about here shortly, in the early 1300s, and it will reach north and western parts of Europe in the 14 and 1500s. What leads to the Renaissance? There has always been a scholarly interest in the classics, even in the Middle Ages. We talked a little bit about how dark were the Dark Ages. But universities throughout the Middle Ages will keep these classics, look at them, but it's very limited, and there's not a lot of communication or travel to share ideas. These ideas will remain very isolated. It will become much more common. Books will be cheaper, and there will be more trade and exchange of ideas over these classics in the Renaissance period. The printing press, if you look over here, we have a schematic of a printing press that you would put in all this movable type, and you could print the same imprinted page over and over and over. This made books and any type of print media, posters, pamphlets, etc., much, much cheaper. This meant there was more written word available in the public sphere. This will raise literacy rates, increase education, but will also help spread more and more ideas. We also have patrons of the arts. Patrons of the arts are people who financially support the arts. So they have to have the money to do that. So you have to have a improved economy in Europe before you have people who can pay for lots of art and architecture. Those things are expensive, and they're you can't pay for those until your necessities are taken care of. And so that will start to happen in Italy under those trade agreements that we looked at in the video between Venice and the Ottomans, right? Italy starts becoming very, very wealthy. And so you have this class of people who can afford to spend significant amounts of money on artistic endeavors. We also have growing rulers, class of rulers, these consolidating rulers, these competing princes in Italy, who want to show their wealth and status as well. And art, architecture, sculpture is a great way to do that. Whether you're a private citizen, one of these lords, nobles, wealthy middle-class traders, it's a way to show your wealth, but it's also a way for the church and kings and nobility to show their wealth and legitimacy as well. Look what I can build, right? Portraits of themselves, things like that. And finally, we've reinstituted that contact with the Middle East. We talked about this as a major outcome of the Crusades, this idea of kind of reawakening Europe to the Mediterranean world, the diversity that is there. And remember, when Rome fell, it was really these Muslim empires, these Muslim kingdoms like the Umayyad and the Abbasid, who will build cities and universities and libraries that will study and preserve and keep these ancient texts of the classical period that now that Europeans are interested, they can access because they were preserved by Muslims around the Mediterranean. Sorry. So why Italy first? It's really mostly money. Italy is one of the first places in Europe to start having cities and regional and interregional trade, and thus seeing a economy that will grow beyond just a local manorial economy. Beyond trade just creating money, however, we have to remember that being a trade center, cities like Venice that are economic trade centers are also getting exchange of ideas. So they're the ones that are going to be getting the technology and the ideas from those Middle Eastern libraries that have preserved the text. And lastly, if you look at this map of Italy, a major advantage Italy has is competition. There's not a lot of consolidation of power in Italy. If If you remember back to when we talked about feudalism, we said in those late Middle Ages, a few places started having a single king who controlled lots of territory and was over those lords. Places like England, France, and Spain. That is not happening in Italy. You can see each of these different colors is a separate kingdom or duchy, republic, right? These would be democracies. They're republics. Duchy, ruled by a duke, right? A republic. Papal states. This is the kingdom ruled by the Pope and the Catholic Church. Kingdom, right? So what this means is you have a lot of competing leaders. This leads to economic competition, but also competition over ideas. A lot of rulers who feel the need to show their legitimacy. The intellectual side of the Renaissance movement is really about this concept of humanism based on studying humans. This will be in contrast to scholasticism. Scholasticism was your intellectual movement for the most part of the Middle Ages. Guys like St. Thomas Aquinas and monks and priests in these monasteries or in the universities who are really trying to look at bits of the classical, but really only the classical in the sense of how it could also work within the confines of the church, right? Not looking at anything that would really counteract church doctrine or try to understand the miracles of God's work on earth and try to understand the science. It was really heavy on the religion side. That will change with the Renaissance as we move toward humanism. Again, human. It will focus on those original documents, whether they conflict with Christianity and the Catholic Church or not. They will not reject a document because it was written by someone who was polytheistic. They really will focus on empirical evidence. Empirical meaning things you can see, measure, feel by touch, right? As opposed to an emotional or a spiritual piece of evidence, right? You have to be able to prove it. And so we really start moving toward that. We'll see this taking another notch when we start looking at the age of reason and the scientific revolution. Humanists really also want to meet a wider audience, not just within the religious community, but also within the secular community, secular non-religious. And so they're much less concerned with trying to figure out the miracles of God than to try to explain kind of natural phenomenon. Big leaders of this movement would be Petrarch, Erasmus, Machiavelli, and that should be Sir Thomas More. Here you can see Petrarch. He was an Italian, mostly a poet, a scholar as well, and he's generally considered the father of humanism. If you look at the dates, he's on the very early side. And he would write secular. Again, Middle Ages, almost everything was religious. If there was art, it was religious art. If there was science, it was religious-based science. And that's really where humanism starts to look at and think about human things, earthly things. The humanists would not have seen themselves as not Christian. They believed, they were just focused on things that were secular. Didn't mean that they rejected the religious, they were just looking at it through the lens of the secular and earthly. You may have talked about Petrarch before. Here you see a Petrarchan sonnet, and it's all about how many lines and what the rhyme pattern is. I think the other one is a Shakespearean sonnet. So you may have talked about Petrarch before. Here we have a gentleman named Machiavelli. Machiavelli was an advisor to a royal court in Italy. And if you remember back to that map, remember all those competing kingdoms. Lots of rulers who were very concerned with how to gain power, how to keep power, how to defend their kingdom. And so he writes this treatise, this letter, advising the prince. Particularly this prince, Lorenzo de' Medici. The Medicis were incredibly powerful Italian family in this period. He is known for advising really, really harsh rule. And most famously, you see it kind of condensed down to the idea that it is better to be feared than to be loved as a ruler. And that is the way to be a powerful ruler, is to make sure everyone is scared of you and therefore doesn't challenge you or break your laws. Machiavelli is often considered our first political scientist. Now, the side of the Renaissance you're probably more familiar with from pop culture or history classes, art classes before, is the artistic side. Here too we'll see a renewed interest in the classics. Greek, Roman, both techniques, images, columns, arches, characters. We'll see a lot of Greek and Roman characters in Renaissance art. Here again we'll see them commissioned. They might be commissioned by a political leader, a king, or elected official. Might be religious. The church might commission something. And you're starting to get a growing middle class. Those people in Venice, for example, who weren't nobility but have built themselves up to have a lot of wealth in these trading industries. These are all the people that are buying and commissioning these pieces of art. Much like intellectual thought, you will see the Renaissance artistic movement focus on both those things that are godly and Christian, but also those things that are secular. And they would not have seen themselves as non-Christian or excluding Christian, but they also wouldn't have limited themselves to just topics that aligned with the Catholic Church. There are a couple new techniques that we really see innovated in this period. In painting, the biggest one is perspective. We'll look at a slide of that in just a minute. That idea of giving depth as opposed to it feeling one-dimensional. And then we'll see an expansion of dome construction. Bigger, taller, stronger domes, building on that Roman legacy. Here you can see some images that will show you some perspective, the way you start to get these dimensional paintings. Very, very different from what you would have seen in Middle Ages paintings, which all seem very, very flat and one-dimensional. And here you can see a famous example, Brunelleschi's dome, of that increased architecture and artistic influence from the Romans. Here you can see a famous piece of art, Donatello's David. So again, you can see we've not abandoned those religious themes, we're just not seeing art limited to those. Probably your most famous Renaissance artist would be Leonardo da Vinci, not because his work is better than anyone else's, but because he really is so diverse. He is an intellectual, he's an academic, he's an inventor, he's an artist. He's really thinking about and being involved in all aspects of things in the Renaissance. And so when we say Renaissance man, that's usually referring to Leonardo da Vinci. Here you can see two of his most famous works, The Last Supper and Mona Lisa. And they're a great example of a religious themed painting. Again, you see that perspective where there feels like depth. And then a secular painting where this is a woman. There's nothing religious necessarily about her or about the subject matter. Both continue to be studied and highly valued today. Another favorite is Michelangelo. You might start seeing a pattern. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are all named after Renaissance artists: Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, and Donatello. My personal favorite, Michelangelo. My favorite artist, not turtle. His favorite medium was sculpture, but he does architecture, sculpture, painting, etc. My personal favorite piece of art, the Pietà. This is Mary holding Christ after he has been removed and his death on the cross. Very common theme, and this is Moses. So again, religious themes. These are both in Catholic churches. And here you see probably Michelangelo's most famous work, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It's a massive building. Again, this is a ceiling. Here's windows up to a ceiling, and you would come back down to windows. And it's lots of scenes from the Old Testament. And he spent years painting the ceilings. You've probably seen some of these, particularly God making Adam right here. Here would be garden snake, Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. The Renaissance will spread its way out of Italy, particularly to the north and west. The Northern Renaissance, it'll happen a little bit later, by the 14 and early 1500s. It tends to have a little more realism. You can see these both seem, I don't know, a little bit darker. And your big names here would particularly be Dutch. People from the Netherlands like Van Dyck and Dürer. You can also see here that secular, right? These wealthy nobles getting a painting for legitimacy, right? To show off their wealth and status. 4 characteristics. Review. A focus on the classics, Greek and Rome. Focus on secular, not rejecting religion, but focusing on the secular. A sense of curiosity and seeking knowledge, and increased literacy, reading, writing, again, thanks to that printing press. And then impacts. In art, we have new techniques and growing popularity in art. There's more art in the world. It challenges the church. We're going to see this grow in 6.2 with the Reformation. And then lastly, that growing